Hi, I am Savio Fernandes and I'm going to talk about a book that I read. The name of the book is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Man's Search for Meaning sold over 10 million copies and became one of the most influential books in the world. During the Holocaust in 1940s, Viktor Frankl spent 3 years as a prisoner in the Auschwitz and Dachau concentration camps. His wife, father, mother, and brother died in these camps. He was faced with extreme hunger, debilitating illnesses, and brutal living conditions. Yet, unlike the prisoners around him, he somehow managed to find hope and meaning during one of the most catastrophic events in human history. Now, there are three powerful lessons that we can learn from the book. The first lesson is he who had a why to live for can bear almost any harm. The example for this lesson is Frankel was confronted by a fellow inmate. The fellow inmate shared a dream he had in February 1945. A voice told him he could wish for something. So he wished to know when he would be liberated from the concentration camp and have his sufferings come to an end. The voice replied March 30th. The inmate had a strong sense of hope and was convinced the voice in his dream was right. As the date ticked closer, the war got worse, making it appear to be very unlikely that freedom was near. On March 29, the inmate suddenly became ill, and on March 30th, the day he expected to be free, he lost consciousness, and on March 31st, he was dead. Frankel said, the ultimate cause of my friend's death was that the expected liberation did not come, and he was severely disappointed. This suddenly lowered his body's resistance against the latent typhus infection. So his faith in the future and his will to live had become paralyzed, and his body fell victim to illness. And so the voice of his dream was right after all. The learning we get from the lesson is any attempt to restore man's inner strength in the camp has first to succeed in showing him some future goal whenever there was an opportunity for it. One had to give them a why and aim for their lives in order to strengthen them to bear the terrible how of their existence. Basically, the prisoners who found a reason to live had a stronger will to live and chance of coming out alive, and those without a reason to keep going increased the likelihood of severe illness and death. The second lesson is love is the ultimate and highest goal to which a man can aspire. The example for this lesson is two prisoners who were contemplating suicide. They used the typical argument that they had nothing more to expect from life, but they didn't commit suicide. Why? Because they found a meaning, a reason to keep going. For one, it was his child waiting for him in a foreign country, and the other man was a scientist who had written a series of books which still needed to be finished. It was one man's love for his child that kept him pushing forward, and for another, it was his love for sharing his findings with the world through books. For Frankel himself, it was the love for his wife that kept him going. The learning from this is a man who becomes conscious of the responsibility he bears toward a human being who affectionately waits for him or to an unfinished work will never be able to throw away his life. He knows the why for his existence and will be able to bear almost any harm. The third lesson is when we are no longer able to change the situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. The example for this lesson is before Frankel was put in a concentration camp, he was working as a clinical psychiatrist. He once had a client with severe depression and he could not overcome the loss of his wife who died 2 years ago. Frankel asked him what would happen if you had died first and your wife would have had to survive for you. He said, for her, this would have been terrible. She would have suffered. Then Frankel said, you see, such a suffering has been started, and it was you who have spared her this suffering. He said nothing, shook Frankel's hand, and calmly left the office. The learning from this is, in some way, suffering ceases to be suffering the moment it finds the meaning, such as the meaning of a sacrifice. Of course, this was no therapy in the proper sense, since first his despair was no disease, and second, I could not change his fate. I could not revive his wife, but in that moment I did succeed in changing his attitude toward his unalterable fate, and he could now at least see a meaning. So these are the three main lessons which we learn from this book. Thank you and have a nice day.